Make up mine. Fight.
Team Fortress 2 can be a daunting game for a new player to learn. Between the 16 plus years of history, the 9 playable classes, each with unique roles, metas, and tech, the over 100 unlockable weapons, and the infinite amount of community in-jokes and lingo, it's easy to say that TF2 isn't the most beginner-friendly game in its current state. However, there do exist some means for new players to more gently ease themselves into the game. A few weapons and playstyles that tend to coddle new players more than others, and give them a more lenient, forgiving learning experience compared to some of the game's other options. These weapons tend to have a few things in common. They tend to have large amounts of upsides, or a single powerful upside, contrasted against some seemingly innocuous yet truly crushing downsides, and they tend to be easier to use than stock, but less effective overall. I find these weapons to be very fascinating, as in the hands of a new or inexperienced player, they could easily seem like must-equips that make you wonder, why are we not running these? Yet in the hands of a more experienced player, the cracks will become much more visible. In this video, I want to talk about 5 of these beginner's trap weapons in TF2. Weapons that tantalize new players with a long list of appealing upsides, yet ultimately teach them fundamentally bad lessons in the long term about the game. If you use these weapons, that's totally fine, and I promise I'm not making fun of you. I like a few of them myself, and just wanted to talk about some weapons in a YouTube video. You'll find that these weapon subcategory videos are actually just mini weapon reviews with a vague unified theme. That said, let's roll.
Only pay for what you need.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
The Liberty Launcher is the first weapon we're discussing in this video, not only because Soldier is the first class who has a weapon in this video in the conventional class order, but also because it's the one I feel epitomizes one of the main design philosophies for this video the most. And what is that design philosophy? Well, it's that these weapons tend to be training wheels. Not in the way that the Rocket Jumper or Sticky Jumper are, but more in the way that makes them easier to use, yet all around weaker than stock or other options. They pad a lot of their respective classes' weaknesses or difficulties, yet sacrifice very important aspects of those classes to do it. But what makes the Liberty Launcher a training wheel weapon? Let's talk about it. The Liberty Launcher is an unlockable rocket launcher for Soldier with 3 very appealing upsides. Its rockets travel faster than stock, somewhere between stock and the direct hit, its rockets deal less damage to the Soldier while rocket jumping, and most importantly, it stores 1 extra rocket in its clip. These upsides are, to put it lightly, extremely strong, and can easily make this seem like a no-brainer must-equip type of weapon. The combination of 1 extra rocket and less damaging rocket jumps on top of a faster projectile with standard blast radius can facilitate a very fun, very mobile, and very active Soldier playstyle. It can be very fun to jump around, hammer enemies with attacks that are too fast and numerous for them to counter, and just overall be a menace on any given map. However, all of these pluses are balanced out by one simple, incredibly punishing downside that makes this less of a no-brainer than you'd probably expect: a 25% damage penalty. Now, this might not seem like a big deal. After all, TF2 has other weapons with damage penalties that are still very strong, and has weapons with damage bonuses that are considered quite bad. Raw damage values are not everything in TF2. And yeah, with the Liberty Launcher, you'll probably find yourself having a bit of fun at first, pelting enemies with attacks, diving important targets, all in all being a very mobile force, but then you'll start noticing some problems. Like, hey, why wasn't I able to secure the kill on that medic? Why did it take 4 close-range rockets to destroy that disabled sentry? Why am I not able to outdamage a tanked sentry during an uber charge? And that's the primary problem with the Liberty Launcher. Soldier, at a fundamental level, is a class who specializes in frontline fighting and killing important enemy playmakers. Being able to kill medics in 2 rockets, damage sentries faster than they can be healed, dive snipers, put out damage in team fights, things like that are integral to Soldier's base role as a class. The Liberty Launcher makes everything that Soldier does easier, but also simultaneously strips away his most important defining trait to do so. The Liberty Launcher is interesting in this regard because it poises to make every aspect of Soldier's game plan easier and more consistent, allowing for a more lenient and forgiving experience playing him, yet sacrifices what makes Soldier such a useful class to do so. Because of this, it can potentially be a very damaging weapon for a new player to stumble across. If they get used to the extra rocket, the faster projectile, and the more forgiving jumps, it can be hard to switch back. And the fact of the matter is that, despite it making Soldier easier to play, you're consistently outputting less damage and thus help helping your team less, making this all around a somewhat selfish rocket launcher. But okay, the Liberty Launcher obviously has its fans, and it's not often in the discussion for worst weapon in the game, so it'd be hyperbolic of me to pretend that it's an objectively bad weapon. I'll admit that I had a lot of fun using the Liberty Launcher at first, and even found myself starting to slip down the stock to Liberty pipeline, but as I played with it, I noticed more and more that I was losing fights, not taking out sentries, letting enemies get away, and just not securing kills that I otherwise would have. And then I realized that I was trying to play stock soldier and not Liberty Launcher soldier. A stock soldier is a powerful, team-anchoring force who can handily solo an entire group of enemies with precision and a little luck. The combination of mobility, spread damage, and sheer damage numbers make him a force to be reckoned with under the right circumstances. A Liberty Launcher soldier, by comparison, lacks those big damage numbers, and may find themselves failing to secure what would have otherwise been sure-win scenarios with stock. Because of this, the Liberty Launcher flourishes as an off-soldier weapon, or as a supplementary weapon for a second or third soldier on a team. It's significantly weaker than stock on its own, and its extra traits aren't really going to help push your team to victory any more than another rocket launcher would. It relies on having another soldier to help anchor your team. And that's ultimately my biggest problem with the Liberty Launcher. Its bonuses are plentiful, yet it ends up strong-arming Soldier into a very specific playstyle that is not his primary role. If you're the only soldier on your team and you're running the Liberty Launcher, then you're depriving your team of extra damage that could be the linchpin in fights just to make your experience more comfortable. It's alluring for sure, but not something you should be falling back on by default at every moment. A weapon for Spy or Engineer that does less damage in exchange for utility is fine because those classes are not frontline gunfighters. But in Soldier's case, his main team utility is outputting damage and securing important kills. And while the Liberty Launcher definitely can do this, it's ultimately worse at it than stock outside of a very specific off-soldier playstyle. Also, because I know some smartass is gonna bring this up, I know Soldier has the banners for team support as well. Damage is not explicitly his only utility, but guess what? You need to do damage to build up the banners, and guess what the Liberty Launcher does less of? All things considered, the Liberty Launcher is an alluring weapon that, like a shady back alley dealer, promises to make all your struggles easier, yet hides the slippery slope of dependency you'll be going down once you start using it. It's padding or cushioning for the soldier's more difficult aspects as a class that, yes, does help, but also cushions your enemies. And as Soldier, cushioning should be the last thing you're concerned about. It's a fun, mobile weapon, yet one that can lead you down a dangerous path if you become dependent on its extra bells and whistles.
You're too slow! Come on, step it up!
We're finally talking about Heavy on this channel. It's good to be talking about my personal favorite class in the game. However, it's also kind of a bittersweet feeling as we're discussing what's probably my least favorite primary available to him in the game, the Brass Beast. The reason we're skipping the conventional class order and moving on to Heavy next is because I feel like this weapon personifies a second type of design mentality for this video. New player bait weapons, or weapons that have such appealing positive stats that someone could easily neglect their likely crushing downsides in favor of taking advantage of those stats. Quick aside though, in MBM specifically, I can't deny that this weapon is great. Heavy doesn't need to move much in MBM, especially on Manhattan, so becoming a player-controlled turret that just vomits out insane damage numbers is totally viable and something that I can't take away from it. Against other conscious, living human players though, I find the Brass Beast to be pretty underwhelming despite its insane numbers. But why is that? The Brass Beast is an unlockable minigun for Heavy with two very appealing positive stats. It boasts a 20% damage bonus over stock, and grants the Heavy a 20% damage resistance bonus when below half health and spun up. The first stat is understandably very tantalizing, as Heavy is already the highest player-controlled sustained damage source in the game, and boosting his damage numbers even further can allow him to easily shred what would have otherwise been very close or tricky battles. Just standing there and vomiting out insane damage is really fun. The damage resistance below half health is also a sleeper underrated stat, as it allows Heavy to tough out fights he would have otherwise crumpled under and leverage his boosted damage for even longer, especially against other Heavies. These two stats are understandably very appealing. Extra damage is generally a good thing, and the damage resistance along with it really articulates that this is meant to be a big numbers type of minigun. Leverage Heavy's already sky-high damage and tankiness with even more damage and tankiness. However, in the previous section, you may have remembered me alluding to a weapon with increased damage that's considered to be quite bad in spite of it, and that, my astute observational viewers, was referencing the Brass Beast. Because despite this weapon's sky-high damage output, its downsides make it a remarkably unfun weapon for me to use in casual PvP gameplay, from my experience anyways. The Brass Beast's two downsides act in unison to make it an all-around mediocre weapon that's profoundly anti-fun to use. It boasts a 50% slower spin-up time compared to Heavy's other miniguns, taking a whopping 1.5 seconds to fully spin up, and makes Heavy 60% slower than stock while spun up. This makes him easily the slowest mobile force in the game, moving even slower than an MBM tank with a standard speed of 15%. For reference, a Heavy with any other minigun spun up moves more than twice as fast as this, and a Heavy while not spun up moves up to 5 times as quickly. Now, this might not seem that bad. I've heard some people argue that since Heavy is already slow, you're not sacrificing too much by moving slower to output more damage. However, I view this as kind of a bad faith observation that fundamentally misunderstands Heavy as a class. Because yes, Heavy is definitely slow, the slowest class in the game, but mistaking him for completely immobile can be a costly mistake. In fact, I've personally found that being able to walk forward while revved up is one of Heavy's strongest traits. When you're playing as Heavy, especially with the backing support of your team, being able to quite literally throw your weight around and leverage your massive health pool and damage to push into the enemy while holding down M1 can be a frightening thing for that enemy to deal with. With proper positioning and good aim, you can basically become a living do not pass wall of damage, preventing everything in your path from pushing past you. You are the purest definition of a team anchor in the game, and being able to leverage your class's positive traits to gain ground on the enemy is one of your strongest abilities. A buffed Heavy with his team behind him pushing into your team can be a difficult thing to surmount without a dedicated hard counter, and it's all around one of my favorite things about Heavy as a class. For reference, which of these two clips do you think looks more fun?
How are they not finding an engineer just walking around aimlessly suspicious?
The Brass Beast, for all intents and purposes, basically turns Heavy into what people who don't play him think he is. A slow, lumbering, predictable, bait-and-punish oriented damage hose that takes no positioning or brain to play well. You're basically required to hunker down and wait for enemies with this weapon, rather than taking a proactive role in battle. The Brass Beast does insane damage, yes, but it strong-arms you into playing an almost entirely defensive and passive playstyle. Trying to be aggressive or forward with the Brass Beast is an exercise in futility. Your slow spin-up time and slow move speed make you about as difficult as an MBM tank to deal with to skilled players. The Brass Beast mandates extremely careful, conservative Heavy play. You have to be very predictive, picky, and choosy with when and where you rev up, as the ability of stock or the Tomislav to jump rev for each individual encounter really isn't an option. A full 1.5 seconds of rev time is a lot in the throes of a TF2 match, and is more than enough for most classes to deal irreparable damage to you before you can even begin fighting back. But, to be totally fair, once you get into groove with the Brass Beast, it can be kind of fun. Once you've gotten adjusted to revving preemptively rather than reactively, and start positioning yourself where fights will be rather than where they are, you can start spitting out some real damage. My core problem with the item, however, is that you're compromising so much of Heavy's flexibility and game plan for what effectively boils down to larger numbers. And those numbers don't even really mean much. Heavy is a sustained damage class, so he's not really concerned about crossing per shot damage thresholds. You're already dealing the highest player-controlled sustain in the game, so do you really need to strap weights to your shoes to deal even more? It just kind of strikes me as excessive and unnecessary. How many fights are you really winning because of that 20% extra damage? Would you have won anyways with the extra second of shooting you would have had with stock that you wouldn't have spent revving up? Important questions to think about. All in all, the Brass Beast is a weapon that I can see the appeal of. Turn a tanky, high-damaging class into an even tankier, higher-damaginger one. However, in practice, it narrows the Heavy's ability so much and turns him into such an immobile force that I wouldn't be surprised if people who hate playing Heavy have only ever really tried using the Brass Beast. I can understand the appeal, but if you're fiercely married to this as your primary Heavy weapon, I strongly encourage you to try out another option and see how much more flexible Heavy can be. He's big, slow, and fat, but he doesn't have to be to this extent. Again, it's not terrible, but it's certainly situational, and is a weapon that mandates you play it rather than playing your class. We have one more category to break down in this video, that being the bad learning tool weapon. This is a type of weapon that may be totally effective or strong in the right hands, yet also teaches new players fundamentally bad lessons about their class. They may encourage you to overuse certain class traits, underuse others, and everything in between. And no weapon strikes me as being as much of a bad learning tool as the Phlogistinator. The Phlogistinator, or Flog, is an infamous weapon within TF2, with its combination of power against inexperienced or uncoordinated players, presumed brain-dead ease of use, and habit of encouraging players not to use one of Pyro's fundamental abilities, making it controversial at best and downright hated at worst. Depending on who you ask, you'll receive any numbers of opinions about this weapon, ranging from it being overpowered and broken, to one of the worst weapons in the game, to anywhere in between. Let's try and get to the bottom of this item's tepid reception. The Phlogistinator is a flamethrower for Pyro that fires a steady stream of beam-like flames, which behave identically to Pyro's stock flamethrower. Same damage, same afterburn, same everything. As it deals damage, however, it steadily builds a meter known as the oomph meter, which takes a total of 300 damage to fill across any of Pyro's damage-dealing sources. Once it's full, the player can activate a special oomph taunt, granting them brief invulnerability and full crits for around 8 seconds. This makes the Phlogistinator's primary use case very clear. It's a high damage oriented flamethrower that allows a smart and careful Pyro to easily steamroll an entire enemy team, running them over with an 8-second stream of guaranteed crits. This ability is compounded by the fact that the oomph can be built by dealing damage with any fire-based weapon, including secondaries, or if you wanted, even the sharpened volcano fragment. On top of this, the taunt can be held for as long as you want, so long as you stay alive, allowing you to save it for optimal use. Here's a clip of me completely ruining an enemy team's game-winning pub push because I pressed G. However, even with as strong and potentially over-centralizing this guaranteed crits for damage mechanic might seem, it's balanced out by the Flog's primary negative: no Air Blast. This is deceptively huge, as, make no mistake, the Air Blast is the thing that keeps Pyro from being the easiest and most linear class in the game. Think about everything Air Blast does for Pyro. You can extinguish teammates for one, offering team utility and a bit of self-healing. You can disconnect and interrupt Ubers, which is hugely important, as Pyro is one of the only dedicated Uber counters in the game, and you can reflect projectiles, which is both strong, makes it easier to fight soldiers, and enables a ton of advanced tech. Air Blast is Pyro's most important tool. So much is mapped to that right mouse button. Taking it away in exchange for a weapon that encourages you to just walk at enemies is a clear recipe for a design that's bound to be controversial. Full disclosure, the Flog is probably one of my least favorite weapons in TF2. I don't think it's terribly fun to use, as just pushing into enemies holding mouse 1 on Pyro lacks the visceral satisfaction and positioning required to keep the same thing fun to do on Heavy, and the lack of Air Blast makes you helpless against soldiers attempting to interrupt your push by juggling you. It's a noticeably limited and linear weapon that, yes, can be fun and get results, yet sacrifices so much of Pyro's team utility and tech to accomplish it. However, that's not the main reason I dislike this weapon. The fundamental problem with the Flog is that it is a terrible learning tool for new Pyros. Because imagine for a second that you're Tony Gonzalez 2009. You've just installed TF2 and you're having a good time. However, you're finding yourself struggling to secure kills, but then you find this fancy futuristic looking ray gun for Pyro through random drop. You equip it and immediately find yourself running over entire teams of hapless free-to-plays. Wow, you might think, this weapon is strong and all I have to do is walk forward. You're securing kills and interrupting pushes, but unbeknownst to you, you're also setting in place bad habits. You're learning that walking forward with the Flog gets kills. You're learning that you don't need Air Blast to kill enemy gamers as Pyro. You're learning how to play the class in a fundamentally incorrect and selfish way. And that information is getting instilled in your still learning new player brain. This is, at a core foundational level, a damaging experience for a new player to have. Even if it is strong in the right hands, I have trouble enjoying a weapon that I know is teaching new players the wrong lessons about their class. And I fully realize that this is ultimately just a weapon in a 16-year-old game and that it ain't that deep, but when this game's continued growth and success hinges on new players and their positive experiences, I can't help but find stuff like this a little bit problematic. All in all, the Phlogistinator is a perfectly fine weapon in the hands of an experienced player who can understand its strengths and weaknesses, but in the hands of a potential fresh install, it's a damn near crippling weapon that can permanently instill bad habits into their fresh install brain. If you're reliant on the Flog or find yourself neglecting Air Blast, I'd say to try some other options and see what Pyro can really do with their foot off the gas pedal.
I can't talk right now. I'm making piss.
We've discussed a few different types of weapons in this video so far, so why don't we discuss an item that combines all three of our aforementioned categories into one. This is a weapon that acts as training wheels, has a lot of positive stats contrasted against a small number of very important downsides, and teaches players the wrong lessons about their class. It's also, funnily enough, my favorite weapon to use in this video. We'll talk about that. The Sydney Sleeper. The Sydney Sleeper is an interesting weapon because it's one that completely strips away its class's primary positive trait and role in exchange for a focus on team utility. Team utility that ultimately isn't much stronger than what Sniper is capable of doing with stock. And yet, I don't hate it. It's a weapon that tantalizes players with a hefty lineup of positive stats and can definitely be very fun to use, but just kind of performs worse than stock in actual practice. That said, it's also different enough from stock that I don't really feel like any truly negative habits are being instilled into anyone using it. Let's talk about it. The Sydney Sleeper is an unlockable sniper rifle for Sniper with a hefty lineup of positive stats. It charges 25% faster than stock, scoped headshots with it apply Girardi or a 35% damage debuff to enemies for up to 5 seconds, and it can extinguish teammates with fully charged shots, on top of its headshots dealing mini crits, as well as removing 1 second from your Girardi's recharge timer. This is a very sizable lineup of positives, and it clearly sets this weapon's primary use case in stone. It's a support-oriented sniper rifle with a focus on debuffing enemies and securing light class picks with a speed and consistency that stock cannot accomplish. Shooting a faraway enemy and applying 5 seconds of Girardi can be more than enough to help your team secure the kill on that important target, and you can still handily one-shot every light class with 150 or less HP with body shots. The faster charging speed makes this even more consistent, and it can be very fun to delete medics and light classes with a wave of your finger and a flick of your dick. The Sydney Sleeper is primarily balanced out by a very important, somewhat misleading, weapon-defining negative stat. No headshots. That's not entirely true, as it does deal mini crits on headshot rather than a full crit, but it does still mean that even with a mini crit fully charged headshot, you're only dealing a per shot maximum of 203 and cannot one-shot heavies or buffed soldiers under any normal gameplay circumstances. This might not seem that important as you're applying Girardi with each shot and providing team support from a distance. However, it stands to reason that using stock or another sniper rifle and getting a headshot to guarantee an instant kill on any important target is probably more valuable to your team than debuffing that enemy and hoping that they secure the kill on them. The Sydney Sleeper simply lengthens and overcomplicates the process of securing picks as Sniper. Even if you can one-shot medics and snipers, arguably the most important picks with a body shot, and can apply Girardi from a distance, you'd arguably be helping your team just as much, if not more, by headshotting and instantly killing any important targets. Even then, stock can also one-shot medics and weaker classes with body shots, so this weapon is ultimately just kind of redundant. The faster charging speed helps, but you also have a lot of downtime on Sniper to charge. It can be very fun to use, but you're all around just adding extra steps to the sniper's job when using it. I've been avoiding using this term up to this point in the video, as I feel it's pretty reductive, but the Sydney Sleeper really does strike me as just kind of a crutch. It removes the pressure and obligation of getting headshots in exchange for an ideological bonus that's, all things considered, slower and less consistent than what you're capable of with stock. Sure, you don't have to worry about landing headshots and can still help your team out with body shots, but I have trouble internalizing this as anything other than compensation for players who aren't consistently able to land headshots but still want to play snipers. And you know what? Even with all of that said, and all of the points I've made up to this point in the video, I still kind of like the Sydney Sleeper.
It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me.
As I've said, this is probably my favorite weapon in this video to actually use. Part of this is because I myself suck at landing headshots and usually default to fully charged body shots anyways, but also just because it's kind of like fun to use. Like, landing a fully charged body shot and dropping enemies with that splash of Girardi and unique sound effect is uniquely satisfying as far as sniper goes, and it can be really enticing to watch enemies scramble as they lose half or more of their HP and get Girardi'd at the same time. Plus, this weapon looks, sounds, and feels different to use in the stock sniper rifle, so unlike something like the Flog, I feel like most new players will likely realize that this is a side grade and not a guaranteed get out of jail free card for playing the class. I fully acknowledge and realize this weapon's shortcomings. It's effectively padding for people who can't land headshots, but I still kind of like using it every now and then. You can be a real menace to the enemy team with this thing in a way that's entirely unique from stock. However, even my opinion here speaks to a larger issue with the Sydney Sleeper. If I use this item partially because it aligns with my lack of an ability to land headshots, then surely I'm not the only one. This is a weapon that, like the Liberty Launcher from earlier, provides cushioning and padding to one or more specific skill-intensive aspects of the class it's featured on. How could you call a weapon that makes the class easier to play in exchange for less power or consistent reliability anything other than a set of literal training wheels? The Sydney Sleeper is, all around, a weapon that epitomizes several design elements we've discussed in this video. It acts as cushioning for players who want to play sniper yet find themselves unable to land headshots. It teaches players not to prioritize headshots, thus ignoring their class's primary job, and boasts an impressive lineup of positive stats contrasted against a seemingly innocuous single downside. All in all, this thing should be my least favorite weapon in the game. And yet, unlike the Flog or the Brass Beast, it boasts a combination of being fun enough to use and different enough from stock to be a uniquely fun experience every now and then. I don't feel like I'm giving anything up, but I all around enjoy this weapon more than some other stuff on this list. I wouldn't recommend using it over stock for most experienced players, but for me, it's my kind of thing.
Here it is, Patrick. The ultimate prank. Invisible spray!
And as our final entry on this list, let's have a bit of a bonus. Every other weapon in this video has been a primary that does damage, but for our final entry, let's discuss a utility weapon, the Cloak and Dagger. This is a weapon that I can personally attest to regarding its nature as a beginner's trap, as I remember thinking this thing was all the rage when I first started playing TF2 over a decade ago. However, as an adult player with more experience, I see this weapon for what it is, a niche if fun side grade rather than a direct upgrade. The Cloak and Dagger is an unlockable cloaking watch for Spy with the following stats. Its cloak regens 100% faster than the stock Invis watch, yet it can't gather cloak from ammo boxes, and it gains 35% less cloak from ammo boxes. Its primary trait, though, is that its cloak reduces based on the Spy's movement, with it draining significantly quicker than stock while running, draining at a slower rate while crouch walking, and starting to refill while completely standing still. This potentially allows a Spy to stay cloaked indefinitely, so long as they're periodically stopping to let their cloak refill. So, this might sound like a perfect weapon. I certainly thought it was as a kid. Infinite cloak so long as I stand still? What's not to like? And yeah, if you want to turn TF2 into a nature documentary where you observe the battle around you, or slowly crouch walk through a battlefield, then it definitely is. However, in practice, the Cloak and Dagger is a weapon that requires a good degree of finesse and a lot of patience to use correctly, which has effectively earned it the nickname amongst the community of the Cloak and Do Nothing. The watch drains its cloak significantly faster than stock while running, so you have to move slow with it. If you attempt to use the Cloak and Dagger like the stock Invis watch, you'll quickly find yourself running out of cloak and sticking out like a sore thumb. Conversely, if you attempt to use it hyper passively and never let your cloak drain, then you'll find yourself never contributing to fights. I found the Cloak and Dagger to be most effective in staking out potential targets and finding tricky, sneaky places to hold while you await the perfect opportunity to strike. Propping yourself up while invisible behind an enemy, patiently waiting for an opportunity, slinking in, securing a pick, and then swiftly escaping while recloaking makes you feel the most like a genuine assassin out of any of Spy's watches. On top of that, it can be surprisingly effective as an escape tool, as the time-honored tradition of hiding somewhere, crouching, and holding still can be pretty good. Most players are inclined to continue chasing the Spy in the direction they last saw them running, rather than checking the area around where they last saw the Spy, so standing still can be a shockingly effective strategy. However, all of this is balanced out by the Cloak and Dagger simply requiring more positioning and execution to use effectively than stock. For a weapon that has a reputation of being brain dead and encouraging players to hide in place for hours on end, finding the right places to position yourself, knowing when and where the best times to hold still or push are, not getting caught by stray fire as you slowly try and sneak in, finding the perfect moments to attack and escape, all of these skills are integral to using the Cloak and Dagger well. As an achievement item, this could very well be one of the first weapons that a new spy player unlocks, and despite its reputation, it is not an easy weapon to use efficiently. It requires a careful mix of finesse and patience. You have to find the right balance between moving enough that you can still do your job, and being patient enough to take advantage of the watch's unique traits. All of this combined makes the Cloak and Dagger an appealing watch, but one that's neither beginner-friendly nor a must-use in every situation. A new player stumbling across this weapon can easily find themselves becoming dependent on it, and considering how careful of a balancing act you have to pull to do it right, combined with it not being applicable to every map and game state, that can be a tricky situation to enter. My number one piece of advice is not to approach the Cloak and Dagger like the stock Invis watch, and not to get too comfortable just hiding from enemies for entire matches. It requires a different, more considerate type of spy play to use well. It can be rewarding, but it can also be a detriment to you and your team if used improperly. Keep that in mind. So, what's my final verdict on some of these beginner's trap weapons in TF2? Well, they tend to be easier, more comfortable, and more forgiving to use than stock, or otherwise offer some kind of tantalizing bonus, yet all around perform worse and generally just provide padding to what are usually easily overcome aspects of learning a class. They poise to offer players shortcuts to learning a class or make the process of learning them easier, yet all that they really do is provide training wheels and teach fundamentally bad long-term lessons. All in all, these are some of the most interestingly designed weapons in the game to me. In the hands of an experienced player, they can be fun side grades or diversions, but to a new, inexperienced, or less skilled player, they can tend to form bad habits and potentially teach players very bad lessons. If you love or main these weapons, then more power to you. I just feel as though, for me personally, there's usually better options, or at the very least, options that sacrifice less to allow more. Still, even with all of this said, lest we not forget that I did get kicked from a match for going on a kill streak with the Brass Beast while recording for this video, and that's ultimately what matters, that people think you're cheating because you're using a weapon too well. Thanks for watching, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!